He didn't knock. Silas Varden walked through Mara Ellsworth's front door like he already owned the place, because in his mind he already did. He dropped a folded paper on her kitchen table without a word, without even looking at her, and said, "You've got 30 days to clear your things out of this cabin." Mara stared at the paper, then at him. "This is my home." "It was your husband's home." Silas straightened his coat. "Caleb's gone. Which means what was his passes through proper inheritance, not through a wife with no blood claim to the Ellsworth name worth a damn in territorial court." She didn't cry, not in front of him, but her hands were shaking so hard she had to press them flat against the table just to stay standing. If you've ever had someone try to take the only thing you had left, if you've ever stood in your own home and felt like a stranger, then you already know exactly how Mara felt in that moment. And you won't be able to stop watching what she does next. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And while you're watching, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Mara. The paper Silas left on her table was 3 pages long and written in the kind of legal language designed to make ordinary people feel small. Mara read it twice, then a third time. The words territorial inheritance statute appeared 4 times. The phrase surviving spouse with no recorded deed transfer appeared twice more. She understood enough. Silas Varden was using the law like a crowbar. It had been 9 months since they brought Caleb home. 9 months since a ranch hand named Pete Duggan rode up to her door in the gray morning and said, "Mrs. Ellsworth, ma'am, there's been an accident at Ravenbreak Pass," and the whole world she'd built with her husband collapsed into a single sentence. The burial had been simple. Caleb wasn't a man who wanted fuss. Half of Red Willow Basin showed up anyway, not because they were close to him, but because in a frontier settlement, a man dying young was a reminder of how thin the wall was between any of them and the same ending. Silas had stood at the graveside with his hat in his hand and his eyes dry. Mara had noticed that. She hadn't said anything about it. Grief, she figured, moves differently through different people, and Silas was not a warm man to begin with. She stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt 3 weeks after the burial, when he first approached her with paperwork. Back then it had been a single document. Friendly suggestion, he'd called it. A voluntary transfer of the ranch deed into his name for management purposes, while Mara, who had never handled cattle operations, found her footing. He'd even smiled when he said it. A tight, controlled smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. He'd nodded like he expected that answer and left without argument. Then the lawyers started coming. The first one arrived 6 weeks after Caleb's death, carrying a leather satchel and a polite manner that vanished the moment she declined to sign anything. The second one came 2 months later with a different strategy, not voluntary transfer, but a legal freeze. He cited the territorial statute Silas apparently loved so much and explained, in very patient terms, that until the inheritance question was formally resolved by the court, all assets belonging to the estate of Caleb Ellsworth were frozen, including the ranch, including the cattle, including the small savings account at the Basin Bank that Mara had added her own wages to every month for 3 years. Frozen. She'd asked what that meant practically. The lawyer had smiled with his mouth only. It means you shouldn't make any large financial decisions until the matter is settled. What it actually meant was that she couldn't sell a single head of cattle to pay her bills, couldn't access her own money, couldn't do anything with the property she'd lived on, worked on, and improved with her own 2 hands since the day she and Caleb moved in. What it actually meant was that Silas had turned her into a prisoner inside her own life. That was when Mara Ellsworth started washing other people's clothes. She wasn't ashamed of it. She'd grown up working, and work had never frightened her. But there was a particular kind of humiliation in hauling a basket of the Dunner family's laundry across town, when 2 years earlier she'd sat beside Caleb at the Basin Founders' dinner as a landowner's wife. The Dunner girls would sometimes watch her from the porch. They weren't cruel about it. They were just watching. the way people watch something they expect to fall. She repaired tack too, saddles, bridles, the worn leather straps that hard-working horses went through constantly. It was careful work, and it paid decent for what it was. Not decent enough, but decent. She was doing exactly that, sitting at her small table with an awl and a strip of saddle leather when Rowan Mercer first stopped at her fence. She'd seen him before in the way you see most people in a small settlement across a distance, passing on the road, the kind of recognition that doesn't quite become acquaintance. He was building a cattle operation on the north end of the valley, one of the newer ranches, not yet large enough to be impressive, but not so small it looked hopeless. People said he worked harder than his land could keep up with. That first day, he just stopped his horse at her fence post and said, "Mrs. Ellsworth, I've got a split in my rig I can't seem to fix right. Somebody in town said you do leather work. I do. She didn't stand up from her work. Wondering if I might leave it with you." He paused. "I could pay up front if that helps." She looked up then. Most people didn't offer to pay up front. Most people paid when they remembered to, which was not always promptly, and sometimes not at all. "Bring it around," she said. He did. He didn't linger. Didn't make conversation past what was necessary. Left her the rig and the agreed payment, and rode off without any of the excessive sympathy people usually wrapped around their dealings with her, that particular tone people used with widows that was somehow worse than outright pity. She noticed that, too. The rig was back to him by the following morning. He stopped by to collect it, said it looked better than when it was new, and left. That was all. He came back 3 days later with another piece of work. Then again the week after. It was on the 4th or 5th visit that he leaned against the fence post instead of riding off immediately. Not in a pushy way, more like a man who was tired and had nowhere particular to be in that exact moment. "You been out here since the freeze started?" he asked. "Yes, that can't be easy." "No," she said. "It isn't." There was a long pause, not uncomfortable. More like the pause of someone choosing their next words carefully enough to mean them. "I've got a cord of firewood I cut more of than I need," he said finally. "It'd just sit and rot before I get through it. I could bring some by if you'd use it." She looked at him for a long moment. She'd had other offers. Offers that came wrapped in something she didn't want, that expected gratitude in a form she wasn't willing to give. She'd learned to say no to most of them without guilt, because most of them weren't really offers. Rowan Mercer looked back at her with an expression that didn't ask for anything at all. "All right," she said. He brought the wood the next afternoon. Stacked it himself along the cabin wall where it would stay dry under the eave. When she came out with 2 cups of coffee because it was cold enough that it seemed rude not to, he took the cup and drank it standing up. And they talked about nothing serious for about 15 minutes, the freeze coming early. The state of the North Road, whether the basin was going to get a proper doctor before the decade was out. Normal things, easy things. She didn't realize until he'd ridden off again how long it had been since she'd had a conversation that wasn't about her loss, her legal troubles, or how she was managing. People in Red Willow Basin were not unkind, but they treated her like a problem to be observed, and Rowan Mercer was the first person in 9 months who'd just treated her like a person. She thought about that longer than she intended to. It was about 2 weeks after the firewood that something shifted, something small but heavy. She was at the fence when he stopped, and instead of handing over a piece of equipment or offering something useful, he just sat on his horse and said, "You doing all right?" Not in the polite way people said it, in the way that meant he was actually asking. And she said because she was tired, and because something about him made her less careful than usual. Caleb's horse came back. Rowan went quiet. "After the accident," she said. "They told me Caleb's horse threw him at the pass." "Panicked," they said. "Steep ground, loose rocks. The horse spooked and went off the trail." She pressed her lips together. His horse came home 2 days later, walked into the yard calm as you please. No injury, didn't favor a leg, didn't have a scratch on him. Wasn't frightened of anything. Rowan looked at her steadily. Horses that go through something like what they described, that horse should have been in a state, she said. Should have been showing something, but he wasn't. He walked straight to his water trough and drank like he'd had a normal day. The silence stretched out between them. Did you tell anyone? Rowan asked. I mentioned it. The sheriff's deputy said animals recover different from people. Said I shouldn't read too much into it. She paused. I let it go, because I was grieving and I didn't trust myself, and everyone around me kept saying I was looking for reasons where there weren't any. Do you still think there weren't any? She looked at him directly. No, she said, I don't. Something changed in Rowan's expression. Not alarm. More like a man who'd just heard a door open that he hadn't known was there. Tell me everything you remember, he said, and she did. She told him about the morning Pete Duggan rode up. She told him about the way Silas had arrived at the burial with dry eyes and a prepared expression. She told him about the paperwork that started coming 3 weeks later, and the lawyer with the leather satchel and the freeze, and the 30-day notice Silas had dropped on her table that morning like it was an afterthought. Rowan listened without interrupting, without offering solutions she hadn't asked for, without telling her what she should have done differently. When she was finished, the wind had picked up and the cold was working through her jacket. Silas found those lawyers fast, Rowan said slowly. Within 3 weeks, Mara said. That's not grieving time. That's prepared time. She hadn't put it in those words before. But the moment he said it, she felt the truth of it land somewhere deep. Nothing else, she said. The mineral survey. Rowan's eyes sharpened. What survey? I don't know for certain. I heard something from the Basin Land Office clerk. About 8 months ago, she mentioned that someone had ordered a survey of the land around Ravenbreak Pass. I asked who, and she went quiet and changed the subject. Mara folded her arms against the cold. I didn't push it at the time. I didn't know what I was pushing toward. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. When did Caleb die? He said. October last year. And when was the survey ordered? She looked at him. I don't know exactly. I think we should find out, Rowan said. The we surprised her. She hadn't asked him for it. She hadn't even allowed herself to want it, because wanting help had started to feel like another way of losing ground. But it sat there between them, simple, offered, not attached to anything she'd have to repay. Why, she asked, not suspiciously, just honestly. He looked at her without flinching. Because something happened to your husband that doesn't make sense. And someone's been using that to take everything you have. And I don't think that should just continue. She studied him for a long moment, looking for the angle, for what he wanted underneath the words. She didn't find one. Rowan, she said carefully, I don't have anything to offer you for this. No money, no land, the ranch is frozen and the silver. She stopped. Caught herself. She hadn't meant to say that. Rowan went very still. What silver? He said quietly. Mara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and made a decision, the kind that feels either like the beginning of something or the end of everything, and you don't know which until much later. There were stories, she said, old ones, about the land at Ravenbreak Pass, about what might be underneath it. She looked at him steadily. Caleb never put stock in them, but about 6 months before he died, he rode up there by himself. Came back quiet, wouldn't tell me why, and a week later he started asking me questions about inheritance law. The wind moved through the fence posts between them. He was trying to protect it, Rowan said. I think so. Her voice didn't waver, though she had to work to keep it that way. And I think somebody else knew about it first. Rowan sat back on his horse. He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that means a person is thinking for real, not just waiting for a turn to talk. Silas knew about the silver, he said finally. And Caleb owned the land above it. Then Caleb's death wasn't just convenient for the inheritance. Mara said nothing, but her jaw tightened. It was the whole plan, Rowan said. The words fell between them, like a stone dropped into still water. Because if Rowan was right, and in the cold, clear-eyed part of her that had been asking uncomfortable questions for 9 months, Mara believed he was then the accident at Ravenbreak Pass wasn't an accident at all. And the man who'd been sending lawyers to her door, freezing her accounts, and dropping 30-day eviction notices on her kitchen table had done something far worse than legal maneuvering. She felt something shift inside her then, not collapse. Something harder than that. Something that would take a long time to become a word, but that started right there, at a weathered fence post in the cold Montana Territory air, with a rancher who had no reason to stay but stayed anyway. She pressed her hands flat on the top fence rail, let the cold wood anchor her. "What do we do first?" she asked. Rowan looked at her with steady eyes. "We find Harlan Pike," he said. Nobody in Red Willow Basin knew where Harlan Pike had gone. That was the first problem. The second problem was that nobody seemed particularly interested in finding out. Rowan started asking around the following morning. Casually, the way you ask about someone you're not especially worried about a former hand, lost track of him, wondered if he'd found work somewhere north of the valley. The men at the feed store shrugged. The woman running the Basin post office said she thought he'd moved on sometime last winter. The blacksmith, who knew most people's business whether they wanted him to or not, got quiet in a way that wasn't natural and said he couldn't recall. Couldn't recall. A man who'd lived and worked in the same 20-mile valley for 3 years. Couldn't recall. Rowan noted that and kept walking. Mara, meanwhile, had her own source of information that Rowan didn't the women who hired her to wash their laundry. People talked around women doing domestic work the same way they talked around furniture. They forgot you were listening, or they assumed that even if you heard, you weren't the kind of person whose understanding of the conversation would matter. That was their mistake. It was Mrs. Colfax whose husband ran the Basin's only general store and therefore knew the financial pulse of every family for 30 miles who mentioned Harlan Pike without meaning to. She was complaining about the difficulty of finding reliable help, drifters who took work and disappeared without notice, the general unreliability of men who had no roots in a place. And she said, almost offhandedly, like that Pike boy who used to work the Ellsworth spread. Just vanished. Mara kept her hands moving in the washwater. "I remember him," she said, which was true. Harlan Pike had been one of 3 hands Caleb kept during the working season. Young, quiet, reliable enough. Do you know where he ended up? Mrs. Colfax made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "My Thomas said he saw him through in Harbert's Crossing about 4 months back. Working a horse camp out there." She paused, then added more carefully. "He didn't look well, from what Thomas said. Like something was sitting on him." Mar said, "That's a shame," and moved on to the next shirt. But when Rowan stopped at the fence that evening, she told him about Harbert's Crossing. He was quiet for a moment. Harbert's Crossing was not close. It was a full day's ride east, through country that wasn't hostile, but wasn't welcoming either the kind of terrain that a man might choose specifically because it required effort to reach. A man doesn't move to a horse camp in Harbert's Crossing because he found better work, Rowan said. No, Mara agreed. He moves there because he doesn't want to be found. Rowan looked at her steadily. I'll go. I'm coming with you. He started to say something and stopped, looked at her face. Decided against whatever argument he'd been forming. All right, he said. They rode out at first light, before the Basin was properly awake, which was deliberate. Mara didn't want Silas to know she was moving. She didn't know how many people in Red Willow Basin reported back to him. She suspected more than she could comfortably account for, and the last thing she needed was for Harlan Pike to receive a visitor before she and Rowan arrived. The ride was long and mostly quiet, which suited both of them. Mara wasn't a woman who felt the need to fill silence, and Rowan seemed to understand that instinctively. They talked some about the land they were crossing, about the condition of the road, about a hawk that sat on a fence post, and watched them pass with an expression of complete indifference. Not about what they were riding toward. Not yet. It was past midday when they found the horse camp. It was a modest operation, 4 buildings in various states of repair, a large corral holding maybe 15 horses, a smell of hay, an animal that was not unpleasant if you were used to ranch work. A boy of about 14 was working the corral fence with a hammer and nails and stopped to stare at them as they rode up. "We're looking for Harlan Pike," Rowan said. "He work here?" The boy stared a moment longer. "I'll get Mr. Dorsey," he said, and disappeared into the nearest building. The man who came out wasn't Harlan Pike. He was older, thick through the shoulders, with the look of someone who'd spent decades working outside and didn't particularly enjoy company dropping by unannounced. He looked at Mara first, then at Rowan. "Help you," he said, in a tone that meant he wasn't sure he wanted to. "Harlan Pike," Rowan said. "We understand he might be working for you." "Might be? Who's asking?" "My name is Rowan Mercer." "This is Mara Ellsworth." Harlan worked on the Ellsworth ranch before her husband passed. Something moved across Dorsey's face. Not quite recognition. More like the expression of a man who'd been waiting for a particular piece of news and wasn't sure whether this was it. "What do you want with him?" "Just to talk," Mara said. "About Caleb." The name landed differently than she expected. Dorsey looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his head and called back toward the smaller building at the far end of the property. "Harlan, you've got visitors." There was a long pause. Long enough that Mara thought the man might have another exit and be considering using it. Then the door to the small building opened and Harlan Pike stepped out. He was younger than Mara remembered, or maybe grief had a way of making everyone look older in her memory. He was 24, 25 at the most. He'd lost weight since she last saw him. His eyes found her face first and then dropped to the ground, and that alone told her something significant. Innocent men didn't look away from widows like that. Guilty men did, or men who knew something they'd been carrying too long. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he said. His voice was tight, controlled. "Harlan." She dismounted without waiting to be invited. Rowan stayed on his horse, which was its own kind of message, a witness, not a threat, but present. "I think you know why I'm here." Harlan glanced at Dorsey. The older man seemed to make a decision and walked back toward the main building without being asked. Not because he was uninterested. Because he was smart enough to know that, whatever was about to happen, he didn't want his name attached to it. Harlan pressed his lips together. "I don't know anything, ma'am." "You know something," Mara said, not harshly. "You left Red Willow Basin 4 months after Caleb died. You didn't tell anyone where you were going. You ended up at a horse camp a full day's ride from anywhere you'd know anyone." She paused. That's not someone with nothing on his mind. Harlan's jaw worked. He stared at the ground between them. "I need to know what happened at Ravenbreak Pass," Mara said. "Not what they told everyone at the inquest, what actually happened." "There was an inquest, Harlan." Her voice was quiet and absolute. "His horse came home without a scratch on it. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight." Harlan Pike went very still, and for the first time he looked directly at her, really looked at her, and she could see it in his face. Not guilt exactly, but something that had been imprisoned behind his eyes for 9 months and was now pressing hard against its walls. "If I say anything," he started. "Nobody told you to leave," Rowan said from his horse. His voice was even. "Matter of fact, nobody ran you out of Basin. You left because you were scared, and you've been out here scared for 9 months. He let that sit for a moment. Whatever you're afraid of is still there whether you talk or not." Harlan looked at him, then back at Mara. His hands were shaking. "The saddle," he said finally. The word came out like something that had been stuck and suddenly broke loose. "I saw the saddle after." Mara said nothing. She didn't move. "They brought it back from the pass with what was left of Caleb's things. Brought it to the bunkhouse to sort through his gear before Mrs. Varden's people came to collect everything." He swallowed hard. "I was the one sorting it, and I saw the cinch. Tell me," Mara said. Harlan pulled in a breath through his nose. "Leather doesn't fail like that. I've been working with horses since I was 9 years old. I know what it looks like when a strap wears through from use, when it cracks from age, when it just gives because it's been stressed too long. He shook his head. The cinch on Caleb's saddle was cut, clean, most of the way through, not all the way so it'd hold at a walk. Hold at a trot, but under any real pressure, any sudden shift in weight or a sharp movements. He stopped. Mara's voice was very controlled. It would fail. Yes, ma'am. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. At a place like Ravenbreak Pass, where the trail bends and the ground drops, and an experienced rider pushes a little harder to make the corner right, yes. It would fail. The cold moved through Mara Ellsworth then. Not the cold of the air, which had been working through her jacket for an hour. Something deeper, something that started in her chest and spread outward like water finding its level. She had suspected it for 9 months. She had told herself she was wrong. She had let people convince her that grief made you see intention where there was none. She had washed other people's clothes and repaired tack and lay awake at 3 a.m. in her cold cabin, asking the question she was finally getting answered right now. Did you tell anyone? She asked. I thought about it. Harlan's throat moved. I went to look for the foreman, thinking I'd show him. But when I went back, the saddle was gone. All of Caleb's gear was gone. Someone had come and collected it while I was out of the bunkhouse for 15 minutes. He looked at her with something raw in his face. I asked where it went. Nobody could tell me, or nobody would. And then, Rowan said, and then 2 days later, Mr. Varden's lawyer came out to the bunkhouse and paid out all the hands to the end of the season and said our employment was terminated. Effective immediately. Harlan rubbed the back of his neck. The other men just took the money and left. I thought about going to the sheriff. I thought about it for 3 days straight. And then. He stopped again. Then what? Mara said. Then Mr. Varden came himself to the boarding house where I was staying in Basin. Harlan's voice changed quality. The shaking in it moved up a register. He sat down across from me and he said, and I remember this exactly because I've thought about it every day since he said, I understand you were very attached to my cousin. That speaks well of you, Harlan. But grief makes a man see things that aren't there. I'd hate for good loyalty to turn into bad judgment. The words hung in the air between the three of them. That was all he said? Rowan asked. He didn't need to say anything else. Harlan looked at Rowan directly. A man like Silas Varden doesn't threaten you outright. He just stands close enough to make sure you can feel how cold he is. And I'm 24 years old with no land, no family, no connections in the territory. And he runs half the business in that valley. His jaw tightened. I packed my things the next morning. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Mara asked the question that had been building since Harlan started talking. Would you be willing to say this in front of a sheriff? Harlan stiffened. Not Silas's sheriff, Rowan said. Gideon Rusk is the Basin sheriff, and whatever else Gideon is, he's not in Silas Varden's pocket. Not completely. How do you know that? Because Silas has tried to influence him twice that I know of, and Rusk both times told him to his face that the sheriff's office didn't operate on suggestion. Rowan paused. He's a careful man, doesn't move fast, but he moves in a straight line. Harlan looked between them. Mara could see the war in his face, the fear that had been living in him for 9 months against something else. Something that might have been relief, or might have been the particular exhaustion of a young man who'd been carrying a secret in a horse camp in Harbert's Crossing, because he couldn't figure out what else to do with it. I don't want to end up like he stopped. Like Caleb? Mara finished. The word landed hard. Harlan flinched. That's exactly why we're here, Mara said. Her voice was calm in a way that had nothing gentle in it. It was the calm of someone who'd already decided. Whatever Silas Varden thinks he's buried with my husband, it isn't as buried as he believes. And if we can prove what you saw, then you are safer on record than you are hiding in Harbert's Crossing. Harlan stared at her. She's right, Rowan said quietly. A man Silas considers a loose end is only safe as long as Silas doesn't remember he exists. Once this goes to court, and it's already going to court on the inheritance question, Silas will start looking for loose ends. It's better to be a witness with a sheriff's protection than to be an inconvenience someone needs to manage quietly. It was a longer silence this time, long enough that Mara heard the horses shifting behind her and the hammer start up again in the corral where the boy had gone back to work. Then Harlan Pike let out a long, uneven breath. "All right," he said. His voice was still not steady, but the word was. They gave him a day to tell Dorsey and put his affairs in order, such as they were. Rowan rode into the nearest town with a telegraph office and sent a message to Gideon Rusk in Red Willow Basin brief. Careful, nothing specific. Just that there was a matter related to the Ellsworth estate that required the sheriff's attention and that new information had come forward. The response came back 6 hours later. It said, "Received. Come when ready. Office will be open." They rode back toward Red Willow Basin the next morning, all three of them, and the journey felt different from the ride out. Heavier in some ways. More real. Like a thing that had existed as a possibility, had crossed some invisible line into something that couldn't be unmade. Mara rode mostly in silence. Rowan led her. Harlan Pike rode behind them both and didn't say much of anything, which she understood. He was riding back toward the thing he'd spent 9 months running from. That required a different kind of courage than the obvious kind, and it wasn't something you could talk your way through. They arrived in Red Willow Basin on a Tuesday evening, when the main road was quiet and the stores were closing up. Mara noticed the curtain move in the window above the Basin Land Office as they passed. She didn't look up long enough to see who was watching. Sheriff Gideon Rusk was exactly what Rowan had described, a careful man who moved slowly and in straight lines. He was 50-something, had been sheriff of the Basin for 11 years, and had a face that gave away almost nothing most of the time. He listened to Harlan's account without interrupting, his expression fixed and unreadable, his hands flat on the desk in front of him. When Harlan finished, Rusk was quiet for a full 30 seconds. Then he said, "And the saddle itself?" "Gone," Rowan said. "Collected from the bunkhouse within 15 minutes of Harlan leaving the room. We believe Silas or someone acting for him removed it." Rusk looked at him, then at Mara. "You've been sitting on this suspicion for 9 months. People told me grief was making me see things," she said. His expression shifted, not softened exactly, but something around the edges moved. "I'm sorry they did that," he said, and it sounded like he meant it, which surprised her. "What happens now?" Rowan asked. Rusk leaned back in his chair with the slow movement of a man who was already carrying the weight of what he was about to do. "I opened the investigation," he said, formally, "which means I'll need Mr. Pike's statement in writing, witnessed and signed. And it means I start looking at the Ellsworth estate documents with a different set of questions in mind." He paused. "It also means Silas Varden is going to know something is happening within 24 hours. "This is a small valley, I know," Mara said. "That doesn't bother you?" She thought about that for a moment. About the paper Silas had dropped on her table. About the 30 days. About 9 months of carrying wash baskets and pressing her hands flat on tabletops to keep them from shaking. "It bothers me," she said, "but not enough to stop." Rusk looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right, Mrs. Ellsworth." The formal statement took most of the next morning. Harlan sat with Rusk's deputy and went through everything twice, word by word, with the deputy writing it all down in the methodical way of a man who understood that the difference between justice and nothing was often a matter of exactly which words were recorded in exactly what order. Mara waited outside the sheriff's office on the bench that ran along the front wall. Rowan sat beside her, not talking, turning his hat in his hands. The street moved around them, the ordinary business of a Tuesday in a small frontier settlement. People carrying packages and exchanging greetings and moving through their days with no awareness that something in the valley was about to fundamentally change. Or maybe some of them did. The storekeeper's wife crossed to the opposite side of the road when she saw Mara. That might have meant nothing. Mara didn't think it meant nothing. "Silas already knows we went somewhere," Rowan said quietly. "Yes, he'll be trying to figure out what we came back with. He'll figure it out soon enough." Mara looked at her hands in her lap. Rowan, the mineral survey, we need to find that before he does anything about it. Rowan was quiet for a moment, the Basin Land Office. The clerk who mentioned it to me, she got quiet when I pressed. That means she knows something. But she got quiet because she was afraid, not because she was loyal to Silas. Mara looked up. There's a difference. You think she'd talk now? I think if Rusk went with us, she might. They didn't have to wait long. Rusk's investigation moved in the slow, straight line Rowan had predicted, but it moved. By the following afternoon, he'd pulled the territorial land records himself and found what he was looking for buried under 3 layers of proxy names and contracted survey companies. Silas Varden had ordered a mineral survey of the land surrounding Ravenbreak Pass. Not after Caleb's death, not even around the time of it. 4 months before. 4 months before the saddle cinch failed. 4 months before the accident that wasn't an accident. While Caleb Ellsworth was still alive, while Silas was still just the older cousin at family gatherings, while nobody in Red Willow Basin had any reason to think of him as anything other than a moderately successful man with moderately successful ambitions. 4 months before he became something else entirely. Rusk brought Rowan and Mara into his office when he had the documents in hand. He laid them on the desk between them with the same flat-handed care he gave everything. Survey was commissioned under the name of a land development company out of Helena, he said. Company doesn't operate anymore, dissolved 8 months ago, which is to say about a month after Caleb died. The ownership records show a holding interest by one Silas Martin Varden. Mara stared at the paper. He knew about the silver before Caleb did, Rowan said. Or around the same time, Rusk said carefully, because he was a man who didn't overstate things. We can't prove the order of discovery. But we can prove he surveyed land he didn't own without the owner's knowledge or permission, while the owner was alive, and that within 4 months of that survey, the owner was dead and Silas Varden had filed inheritance claims on the property. The room was very quiet. Mara looked at the survey document, at the dates, at the careful official language that laid out coordinates and mineral probability estimates in the dry, impersonal language of business. Underneath all of it, beneath the proxy companies and the dissolved holding interests and the territorial statutes and the lawyers with their leather satchels, this was what it came down to. Silver in the ground below Ravenbreak Pass. An older cousin who found out before the man who owned the land above it. And a saddle strap cut most of the way through with a blade that held at a walk and held at a trot and failed exactly when and where it needed to. What do you do now? Rowan asked Rusk. Rusk pressed his hands flat on the desk. I bring Silas Varden in for questioning, he said. And I do it before he has any more time to manage his exposure. He's going to deny everything, Mara said. People generally do, Rusk said without inflection. Doesn't change what we have. What we have is a young man's testimony about a saddle that no longer exists, Mara said. She wasn't arguing against it. She was thinking out loud, working through the edges the way Silas's lawyers would work through them. A mineral survey under a proxy name, a timeline that looks suspicious. He'll say the survey was speculative business interest. He'll say Harlan is a disgruntled former employee. He'll say whatever he can, Rusk agreed. That's why I need you to do something before I bring him in. They both looked at him. Go back to Ravenbreak Pass, Rusk said. You and Mercer, go and look at that trail yourself. Accident story is as weak as you believe. The ground will show it. I want a second account of that location, not a sheriff's account, not a lawyer's account. A widow's account and a rancher's account of the place where her husband supposedly died. What you saw, what the trail looks like, whether it matches what we were all told. Mara was quiet for a moment. She hadn't been back. Not once in 9 months. She told herself it was because there was nothing to go back to, nothing there but a bend in a mountain trail and an old grief. Now she thought it was because some part of her had always known that going back meant finding out something she couldn't unknow. All right, she said. Rusk nodded. I'll give you 2 days. Then I move on Varden, whether you're back or not. They rode to Ravenbreak Pass the next morning. The trail up was familiar to Mara in the way that places associated with loss are familiar through the surface details she'd heard described, not from her own experience. She'd never ridden it with Caleb. He'd gone up alone, on the day he came back quiet and started asking about inheritance law. The trail itself was not what she expected, or rather, it was not what the inquest report had described. The inquest had used phrases like treacherous footing, an unpredictable terrain, an understandable hazard for even experienced riders. She'd read those words and imagined something close to impassable. What she found instead was a trail that was steep in places, yes, and narrow at the upper bend where Caleb's horse supposedly spooked, but firm. Well-traveled, the kind of path that showed the marks of regular use in both directions. Rowan dismounted at the bend and crouched down to look at the ground. Then he stood and walked the full width of the trail at its narrowest point, heel to toe. He did it twice. Wide enough, he said. Wide enough for what? For a horse that knows what it's doing to navigate without trouble. He looked at the edge, the drop below, then back at her. This is steep. I won't argue that, but this is not the kind of ground that takes an experienced rider by surprise. Not someone who knew this trail. He paused. Did Caleb know this trail? He'd ridden it a dozen times. More, she looked at the bend. At the distance from the trail edge to the ravine below. Pete Duggan said the horse panicked, went sideways. There's not enough sideways here for an uninjured horse to go. Rowan said it flatly, without drama. Just a man looking at ground and saying what it showed. A horse that panics moves forward or back, it rears. It bolts. On a trail this width, even a panicked horse is going to have its first instinct be to stop, not to step off the edge sideways. Mara stood at the bend and looked down into the ravine where her husband had died. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying. What she felt standing there was something colder and more specific, the particular grief of a woman who'd been told one story for 9 months and was standing in the place where that story fell apart. He didn't fall because the horse panicked, she said. No, Rowan said. He fell because the cinch gave and the saddle went. Horse would have righted itself the moment it felt the weight go. Experienced animal, familiar trail, it would have righted itself and come home. Calm, no injuries, walking straight to the water trough. Exactly as it had. Mara turned away from the ravine. She didn't need to look at it anymore. She had what she came for, not comfort, because there was none to be found in this place, but confirmation. Solid ground under a truth she'd been told was made of air. We go back, she said. Rowan was already gathering his horse's reins. They rode down from Ravenbreak Pass in the late afternoon light, and Red Willow Basin spread below them in the valley, smoke rising from chimneys, the ordinary life of an ordinary settlement going about its ordinary business. Somewhere in that valley, Silas Varden was going about his day, meeting with his lawyers, reviewing his strategy, perhaps wondering what the widow had ridden out to find the day before and what she'd come back with. He would find out soon enough. Rusk would see to that. But as they rode down, Mara found herself thinking not about Silas and what was coming for him. She was thinking about Caleb, about the day he'd ridden up this same trail alone and come home quiet, about the questions he'd started asking about inheritance law, about the fact that he'd been trying to protect her from something and hadn't known how to say it plainly, or hadn't wanted to frighten her, or had thought he had more time. He hadn't had more time. She pressed her hand flat against her horse's neck for a moment, just to have something solid under her palm. The animal moved steady beneath her, ears forward, feet sure on the trail. Beside her, Rowan rode without speaking. He'd been doing that all day, giving her the silence when she needed it, filling it when she didn't, with no visible effort at calibrating the difference. She didn't know how he managed that so naturally. She didn't know much about him that way, still. But she was starting to understand that what she knew was enough to build from. The basin came closer as they descended. Somewhere in that valley, the truth was about to stop being a private thing between a widow, a rancher, a frightened young hand, and a careful sheriff. It was about to become a public thing. And public things, once released, have a way of reaching further than anyone expects, including the men who have spent their careful years believing that the right kind of pressure, applied quietly enough, could keep anything buried. Even silver, even the truth about how a good man died on a mountain trail in October, on a saddle that someone had made sure would fail. Gideon Rusk moved on a Thursday morning. He didn't announce it. He didn't send a deputy ahead with a summons or any of the formal courtesies that gave a man like Silas Varden time to arrange his face and call his lawyers. He simply rode to Silas's house at the north edge of the settlement, a substantial house, 2 stories, the kind that announced its owner's opinion of himself, and knocked on the front door himself, alone, at 7:30 in the morning when the frost was still on the ground. Mara heard about it from Mrs. Colfax's daughter, who heard it from the boy who delivered firewood to the Varden property and had been on the porch when Rusk arrived. The story moved through Red Willow Basin the way stories always moved in small settlements in pieces, each piece slightly different depending on who was telling it, but with a consistent center. Rusk had asked Silas to come with him to the sheriff's office for a conversation. Had used the word conversation deliberately. Silas had stood in his doorway in his good morning coat and looked at Rusk for a long moment and then said very quietly, "What is this regarding?" And Rusk had said, "The death of Caleb Ellsworth." According to the firewood boy, who was 14 and had the unfiltered recall of someone who hadn't yet learned to pretend he wasn't paying attention, Silas's face did something complicated for about 3 seconds. Then it settled back into its usual arrangement, and Silas had said, "Let me get my hat." Mara was in her cabin when she heard all this. She was sitting at her table with a cup of coffee she'd stopped drinking 20 minutes earlier, and she held it with both hands, not because it was still warm, but because she needed something to hold. She had known Rusk was moving. He'd told them 2 days. She had spent those 2 days doing her work, the laundry, the tack repairs, with a deliberateness that she recognized, even while doing it, as a way of keeping herself from coming apart at the seams. Ordinary tasks, ordinary hours. Keep the hands busy and the mind won't eat itself. It had worked, more or less. But now it was Thursday morning, and Rusk had Silas Varden sitting in a chair across a desk from him, and whatever happened in that room was going to determine whether the last 9 months of Mara's life meant anything beyond suffering. Rowan arrived at her fence mid-morning. He didn't have news. He'd come because it was a day when she shouldn't be alone with her thoughts, though he didn't say it in those words. He said, "Figured I'd see how you're holding up." And she said, "I've been better," which was honest without being indulgent, and he nodded and leaned against the fence posts, and that was enough. They stood there together in the cold, watching nothing in particular. "Rusk will send word when there's something to tell," Rowan said eventually. "I know. Could be today. Could be longer. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "You ever regret starting this?" She thought about it seriously before answering, because it was a serious question and he'd asked it without any agenda attached. "No," she said finally. "I regret that it needed starting." "That's different." He looked at her sideways. Something in his face shifted that thing she'd started noticing, where some internal wall came partway down and then went back up before she could see what was behind it. She filed it away and didn't push. There were enough walls being taken down this week already. The word came the following afternoon, not from Rusk, directly from his deputy, a young man named Aldous Fenn, who had the look of someone who'd been told to deliver a message quickly and not add anything to it. He found Mara at the wash line and said, "Sheriff asks if you and Mr. Mercer can come by the office this evening. Says there's been a development." Mara pulled a clothespin from between her teeth. "What kind of development?" "He just said development, ma'am." "I'm sorry, that's all I've got." She sent word to Rowan through the same boy who'd brought her firewood all season, and they arrived at Rusk's office as the sun was dropping behind the western ridge and the temperature was falling with it. Harlan Pike was already there, sitting in the corner chair with his hands on his knees, looking like a man who had made a decision. He was still deciding whether to stand behind. Rusk waited until they were all seated. Then he said, without preamble, Silas denied everything. Nobody looked surprised. He was cooperative in manner, answered every question, acknowledged the mineral survey, but described it as routine speculative investment, said he'd been interested in the land values around Ravenbreak Pass for years and had commissioned the survey at his own expense as a private business matter, nothing to do with his cousin. Rusk's voice was flat and methodical. He said the timing was coincidental, said he never knew about any significant silver deposit until after Caleb's death. Said the inheritance claim was a legal right he was exercising in good faith, and that any suggestion of wrongdoing was, his words, the desperate invention of a grieving woman who couldn't accept that her husband's death was an accident. The room went tight and quiet. Mara heard the phrase and felt it land. Not with surprise, with the particular familiar exhaustion of a woman who has been described as grieving and desperate, and unable to accept things so many times that the words have worn grooves in her. He's good at it, Rowan said. His voice was controlled. He is, Rusk agreed. He's had practice, speaking in ways that sound reasonable, while saying nothing that can be held against him. He paused. But he made one mistake. Everyone in the room looked at him. I asked him about the saddle. Not directly, I came at it sideways. Asked about Caleb's equipment, whether the ranch gear had been properly inventoried after the estate was frozen. Rusk folded his hands on the desk. He said yes, said everything had been cataloged and stored. Then I asked specifically about the riding saddle Caleb had been using at Ravenbreak Pass. Another pause. Rusk had the manner of a man who understood that some silences needed to be held to their full length. He said it was destroyed, Rusk said. He said the saddle was so damaged in the fall that there was nothing worth keeping, so he'd had it burned. Harlan Pike made a sound, not a word. Just a short, involuntary exhale that said everything about what it meant to have been 24 years old and alone with a secret for 9 months, and now sitting in a room where that secret was being confirmed by the man who'd created it. He burned it, Mara said. That's what he claims. Then he knows there was something wrong with it, Rowan said. You don't burn a saddle because it's damaged. You salvage what you can and discard the rest. There's no reason to burn it unless you need it gone. I agree, Rusk said, and so does the territorial prosecutor I spoke with this morning. Mara looked up. You've already spoken to the prosecutor? Sent a telegraph yesterday evening with a summary of the evidence. Got a response this morning. Rusk unfolded a piece of paper from the inside of his coat and laid it on the desk with the same flat precision he gave every document. He says what we have is circumstantial but substantial. The survey timeline, the inheritance move, Harlan's testimony about the cinch, the burning of the saddle, my account of Silas's response when I asked about it. He paused. He says he wants to examine the full file, and he says he wants to speak with Silas directly. What does that mean for the inheritance freeze? Mara asked. He's filing an emergency motion to extend the freeze pending formal investigation. Which means Silas can't move the property while this is being examined. Mara almost laughed, not from humor, from the strange, vertiginous feeling of hearing that the thing that had been used to imprison her was now being turned around on the man who'd built the prison. He'll fight it, she said. He'll try. Rusk looked at her steadily. But his lawyer called my office this morning, too. Which tells me Silas knows the situation has changed. A man who's confident in his position doesn't have his lawyer make morning calls to the sheriff. Rowan shifted in his chair. When does the prosecutor arrive? 3 days. He's coming from Helena. Rusk looked around the room. I need all of you here when he does, particularly you, mister. Pike, your statement is the most direct evidence we have, and he'll want to hear it from you in person. Harlan nodded slowly. He looked like a man walking towards something he was afraid of, with his fear visible on his face and his feet still moving forward anyway. Mara appreciated that. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. She knew that better than almost anyone. Those 3 days were the longest of Mara's life in a way that the 9 months before hadn't been, because in those 9 months she hadn't known what she was waiting for. Now she did. Now there was a specific thing coming at a specific time, and the waiting had edges to it. She kept working. There was no other way through it. The morning of the second day, something happened that she hadn't prepared for. She was coming back from the Colfax store with a small amount of flour and coffee, the bare necessities that her earnings kept her in. Not enough, and not nothing when she turned the corner of the main street and came face to face with Silas Varden. Not accidentally. She understood that immediately. He was standing at the corner with his coat and his hat and that tight, controlled expression, and he had positioned himself precisely where she had to either turn around or walk past him. She kept walking. He fell into step beside her, which was so unexpected and so casually presumptuous that for a moment she couldn't find the words she needed. "Mara," he said, "Mr. Varden, I'd like to speak with you." "I don't have anything to say to you." She kept her eyes forward and her pace even. "I understand you're angry." His voice was low, conversational, the voice of a man conducting a negotiation in a public space. "I want you to understand that none of this is personal." She stopped. She turned and looked at him directly. Fully. The way she hadn't permitted herself to do since the day he'd walked into her cabin with his 30-day notice, because she'd been afraid that if she really looked at him, she would lose whatever composure was keeping her standing. She wasn't afraid of that anymore. "None of this is personal," she said. Quietly, the main street of Red Willow Basin was doing its morning business around them. People were noticing and trying to look like they weren't. "I've been exercising legal rights under the territorial statute. You cut my husband's saddle strap." The words came out level and precise. "You filed papers to take my home before Caleb's body was in the ground 3 weeks. You froze my accounts and sent lawyers to my door and left a 30-day eviction notice on my kitchen table." She held his gaze. "And then you burned the evidence." His jaw moved. "That is an extraordinary accusation. It's going to be an extraordinary hearing." She picked up her flour and her coffee. "You should speak with your lawyer, Mr. Varden. That's the conversation you actually need to have right now." She walked away. Her hands were shaking, but she walked in a straight line and she didn't look back. She didn't tell Rowan about it that day. She told him that evening, when he stopped by after his own work was done, and his expression went through several things in quick succession: concern, anger, and something that wasn't quite either. "He approached you on the street," he said, "not quite a question. He wanted to talk. What he wanted was to see how steady you are." Rowan's voice was even, but his jaw was tight. "He wanted to know if he could rattle you before the prosecutor arrived." She nodded. She thought the same thing. Could he? She looked at Rowan. "What do you think?" He looked back at her for a moment. Something in his face that she was learning to read the way a particular stillness meant he was choosing his words for real. "I think he underestimated who he was dealing with," he said. "Same as he has from the beginning." She didn't let herself feel too much about that. But she held it. The territorial prosecutor arrived on a Friday. His name was Edmund Hale, and he was nothing like what Mara had pictured. She'd imagined someone formally severe. A Helena man who would look at Red Willow Basin with the mild contempt of someone accustomed to larger stages. Instead, he was medium height, mid-40s, with a plain coat and a direct handshake, and the very specific kind of attentiveness that meant he was listening to everything at once. He met with Rusk first, alone, for 2 hours, then with Harlan Pike for another hour. Then he asked to speak with Mara. They sat in Rusk's office with the sheriff present, and Hale asked his questions without a particular rhythm, not starting at the beginning and moving forward, but jumping between points in a way that felt random and wasn't. She understood gradually that he was testing consistency. Same details from different angles, checking whether the story changed shape under pressure. It didn't. She was careful to say she didn't know when she didn't know, and she said it several times because she'd learned that the most dangerous thing in a legal proceeding wasn't a gap in your evidence. It was pretending the gap wasn't there. Hale asked about the horse. About the inquest, about the timeline of Silas's legal moves. About the conversation she'd overheard that led her to the land office clerk. About the clerk herself. "Did Mrs. Harmon tell you anything directly about who commissioned the survey?" he asked. She mentioned someone had ordered a survey of the Ravenbreak Pass area. Then she stopped herself. Mara paused. She looked frightened. Frightened of what? Of saying more than she meant to, I think. Or more than she felt safe saying. She looked at Hale steadily. I think she knows more than she's said. But I think she's been waiting to see which direction this falls before she decides what she's willing to put her name on. Hale made a note. Then he looked up. That's a precise read of a person you spoke to briefly about a sensitive topic. I've been reading people carefully for 9 months, Mara said. When the people around you are either trying to take something from you or pretending the situation doesn't involve them, you get very specific about the difference. Hale looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something else. She didn't ask what. The meeting with Silas happened on the Saturday. Hale called it a formal interview, which was a courtesy description. Silas arrived with his lawyer, a man named Gripper, from a practice in Helena that didn't advertise in Red Willow Basin because its clients didn't need advertising, and the 4 of them sat in Rusk's office for 2 hours while Mara waited outside on the bench with Rowan and Harlan Pike in a silence that was too tense to be comfortable and too important to break with meaningless noise. Through the wall, she could hear voices, but not words. The tones moved Hale's even and persistent, Silas's lawyer's formal and occasionally sharp, and Silas himself, less frequently, in a voice she'd been hearing for 9 months and would likely hear in her sleep for some time after this was over. Then something changed. About 90 minutes in, the voices shifted. There was a longer silence, then Silas's voice, but different, not controlled in the same way. Something underneath it that she couldn't name through a wooden wall, but that made Harlan sit forward in his chair. Then another silence, longer than any before it. Then Gripper's voice, sharp and sudden. And Hale's response, quieter but very certain. Then nothing for about 10 minutes. Rowan put his hand over Mara's without speaking. She looked down at his hand and then up at his face. He was looking at the door to Rusk's office with an expression she'd never seen on him before, not quite hope, which was too fragile a word for it. More like the expression of a man watching a long storm decide which direction it's going to break. The door opened. Rusk came out first. He looked at Mara in a way that told her something significant before he opened his mouth. Not celebration. Rusk wasn't the type, but there was a quality to his face that was different from every other time she'd seen it. He wants to make a statement, Rusk said. Harlan Pike made the same sound he'd made 2 days earlier, that involuntary exhale. What kind of statement? Rowan asked. The kind that requires a formal witness and a record. Rusk looked at Mara. He's asking that you be in the room. She felt the ground shift slightly under her feet. Not faint, she wasn't that kind of woman. Just the physical response of her body to the information that the thing she'd been pursuing for 9 months was suddenly about to happen in real time. All right, she said. The room felt smaller with all of them in it. Silas was sitting in the same chair where she'd sat the previous afternoon, and the difference between how he'd looked on the street 2 days ago and how he looked now was significant enough that for a moment she almost felt something about it. Not pity, exactly. The ghost of a feeling that had once been a family obligation and was now just a relic. He didn't look at her when she came in. He looked at the wall to the left of Hale's head. Hale said, Mr. Varden has agreed to make a voluntary statement regarding the events preceding and following the death of Caleb Ellsworth. Mr. Varden, you may proceed. Silas's lawyer looked like a man sitting next to a fire that had gotten larger than planned. He'd argued, presumably, against this. He was now managing his expression with the specific professional blankness of someone who'd lost an argument they'd known they were going to lose and was trying to look like they'd intended to end up here. Silas pressed his palms flat on his knees. He stared at the middle distance. I commissioned the mineral survey, he said, 14 months ago under a Helena holding company. I discovered preliminary evidence of a silver deposit beneath the land at Ravenbreak Pass. The previous spring, I'd seen the geological indicators during a ride through the area and had an independent assessment, done quietly before I commissioned the formal survey. Hale said nothing. He wrote, I approached Caleb about purchasing a portion of the pass-adjacent land. He declined. He didn't know what I'd found. I didn't tell him. I said I was interested in expanding my grazing range. Silas's voice was flat, like a man reading from a document he hadn't written. He still declined, said he wasn't interested in selling any of the upper range. Mara looked at him and thought, Caleb, just like Caleb. Stubborn about the land because the land mattered to him, not because he'd known what was underneath it. I made the decision to ensure the property would come to me through inheritance. Silas stopped. Started again. I had access to Caleb's barn. I'd been to the property dozens of times over the years. I knew his saddle, his gear, his routines. Another stop. I cut the cinch. I cut it most of the way through. Not all the way. The room was absolutely still. I told myself he would fall and be injured badly enough that I could step in. Manage the property. Use the incapacitation to push through a deed transfer. His jaw worked. I didn't. I told myself I wasn't trying to. Varden, Hale said, with no particular inflection. You cut the saddle strap on a riding trail with a ravine. Silas was silent for a long moment. Yes, he said finally. Mara heard the word from across the room and felt it move through her in a way that wasn't like anything she had words for. 9 months of not knowing. 9 months of being told she was seeing intentions where there were none. 9 months of wash baskets and tack repairs and cold mornings pressing her hands flat on tables to keep them from shaking. Yes, the cinch failed at the upper bend, Silas said. Failed worse than I intended. I hadn't accounted for, I don't know. The angle of the trail, the particular movement, I'd calculated that it would slip, not that it would go completely. He stopped. Caleb went into the ravine. Rowan, beside Mara, was completely still. Kind of still that takes real effort. He died, Hale said. Not cruelly, just insisting on the full accounting. He died, Silas said, and then you destroyed the evidence. I had the saddle burned before the inquest. Yes. And then you proceeded with the inheritance claim. Silas looked at his hands, the survey, the silver. The deposit is significant. I'd put significant resources into identifying it. I told myself that what happened was that it had happened, and that what was done, and that the only practical response was to continue taking what you'd killed for, Mara said. Her voice was quiet, and she hadn't planned to speak. But the sentence was there, and it was accurate, and she said it. Silas finally looked at her, for the first time since she'd come into the room. Whatever she'd expected to see on his face, defiance, calculation, the performance of remorse he'd have his lawyer polish for the hearing she wasn't prepared for what was actually there. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He looked like a man who had been managing something extremely heavy for 9 months and had just up it put it down and discovered that the weight had done permanent damage to whatever was underneath. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she saw him clearly, which was a different thing. I'm sorry, he said. The words sounded like they'd been in him a long time and cost something to release. Not for what you think I should be sorry for. I mean, I know what I did. I'm not what I'm sorry for is that he was my family. He stopped. The words didn't have anywhere to go. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You don't owe me your guilt, Silas. You owe it to the court. She stood up. I'm done being in this room. She walked out. Rusk let her go. Rowan followed a moment later, and they stood on the bench outside the office in the cold afternoon air, and neither of them said anything for a very long time. The formal arrest happened an hour later. Rusk handled it himself, same as everything calm, methodical, without drama or excess. Silas was taken from the sheriff's office to the Basin's single holding cell, and Gripper left for Helena to begin building a defense that everyone involved already understood was going to lose on the most important counts. The arrest drew attention the way significant events in small settlements always did, not in an organized way, but in the slow accumulation of people finding reasons to be on the main street at a particular time. Some of them looked relieved. Some looked troubled in the way that people look troubled when a man they knew well turns out to be something they didn't see. A few looked at Mara with the specific expression of people who owe an apology and know it and aren't yet ready to offer it. She didn't need the apologies, or rather, she did, but not from them. She needed something else, and the arrest had started the process of getting it, not fully, not yet, but the first real step. What she needed was to mourn Caleb without a question mark sitting over every memory. For 9 months, she'd been carrying grief that was tangled up with suspicion, unable to simply miss him, because missing him kept running into the sense that something was wrong about the way he died. And that sense kept running into the people who told her she was wrong to feel it. The grief had never been clean. It had always been contaminated with uncertainty and the particular loneliness of knowing something you couldn't prove. Now she could grieve him properly, not happily, not easily, not without pain. But honestly, that night after Rowan had gone home and Harlan Pike had returned to the lodging, Rusk had arranged for him through the hearing. Mara sat at her kitchen table alone in her cabin with a candle burning and Caleb's old coffee mug in her hands. It was a plain mug, nothing special. He'd used it every morning for 4 years. She'd kept it washed and on the shelf because she hadn't been able to make herself put it away, and she hadn't been able to make sense of why she was keeping it, and now she thought she understood. She was keeping it because he deserved to be properly missed, and she hadn't been able to do that yet. She sat there for a long time. She didn't make any decisions about the ranch or the silver or the mining companies or the territorial court process. Those things were coming, and she would handle them when they arrived. Tonight, she didn't solve anything. She just held the mug and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd lost and what she'd fought for and what it had cost. Outside, the wind moved through the fence posts. The candle held steady. Red Willow Basin was quiet. And for the first time in 9 months, Mara Ellsworth sat inside that quiet without needing it to become anything else. The territorial court date was set for 6 weeks out, which in Red Willow Basin felt both too long and too short too long because Mara was living in a kind of suspended state, and too short because 6 weeks was not much time to prepare for the thing that was going to either restore her life or finish dismantling it. Silas remained in the Basin holding cell for the first week, then was transferred to the larger facility in Helena when Gripper successfully argued that his client's standing in the territory warranted more appropriate accommodations pending trial. Rusk had opposed the transfer and lost, which he reported to Mara with the flat expression of a man who'd expected to lose and was unsurprised. "Does it change anything?" Mara asked. "Not legally," Rusk said. "He's still charged. His statement stands. One is a longer ride for his lawyers to manage things quietly, which I consider an advantage." He paused. "What it changes is that he's more comfortable than he should be, which irritates me personally, but that's a different matter." Mara nodded. She'd learned that Rusk's personal irritations were worth noting because they were rare enough to be informative. The inheritance freeze remained in place through the investigative period, which meant Mara was still doing laundry and tack repairs and managing on what those jobs paid. She didn't complain about this to anyone, because there was nothing useful that complaining would do, but she was tired in the deep, bone-level way of someone who has been running on determination for so long that the determination itself has become a kind of weight. Rowan noticed. He didn't say anything directly about it. He wasn't that kind of man, but he started appearing with practical things. More firewood, a bag of good coffee he said he'd ordered too much of, which she suspected wasn't true. Twice he brought supper not cooked by him. He was honest enough to admit he wasn't much of a cook, but from the Basin's one eating establishment, packed in a cloth and delivered without ceremony. He'd stay while they ate, and they'd talk about things that had nothing to do with court dates, or prosecutors, or silver deposits, and she would feel herself unknot slightly, which was more valuable than he probably understood. She didn't tell him that either. What she did start telling him, gradually, in pieces, was about Caleb. Not the death and not the investigation, but Caleb himself. The ordinary things. How he'd been stubborn about the land in a way that was sometimes maddening and sometimes the thing she'd loved most. How he'd had a habit of starting sentences and not finishing them when he was thinking something through. How he'd called her Mara girl when he was happy, which she'd pretended to find irritating and had secretly loved. How he'd been a better rancher than businessman and had known it and laughed at himself for it. Rowan listened to all of this the same way he listened to everything fully, without filling the space with his own thoughts before she was done with hers. And something about that listening gave her permission to talk, which she hadn't had much of since the funeral, because the people of Red Willow Basin had spent 9 months either grieving with her in ways that felt performed, or avoiding the topic entirely or using her grief as a backdrop for other conversations. One evening, about 3 weeks before the court date, she said something she hadn't planned to say. They were sitting on her front step in the cold because the cabin had gotten stuffy from the stove being too high, and she was telling him about the first winter she and Caleb had spent in the basin, and how bad it had been, and how they'd managed it badly, and laughed at the wrong moments and been frightened together, which was sometimes better than being frightened alone. "I miss him," she said, and then, because that was obvious and she knew it, I miss him without the question in it now. I can just miss him. That's different from what I've had. Rowan was quiet for a moment. "That's what you were fighting for," he said. Underneath all of it, she looked at him. He was looking out at the fence line, at the cold dark beyond it. "Yes," she said. "I think it was." He nodded slowly. Didn't say anything else. But he also didn't leave for another hour, and they sat there in the cold talking about nothing consequential. And when he finally rode off, she stood at the door for a minute, watching him go, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Something that resembled hope, not for a particular outcome. Forward-facing. Like a window that had been painted shut for a long time had been opened a crack. She went inside before she could think about it too hard. The formal hearing lasted 3 days. It was held in the Basin's community hall, which was the largest interior space in the settlement, and still barely adequate for the number of people who found reasons to be present. Hale managed the prosecution side with the same methodical directness he'd shown in Rusk's office. Gripper defended with a sophistication that was not matched to the evidence available to him, which was to say he was skilled and he was working with almost nothing, and the combination produced a very professional-looking exercise in futility. Silas's voluntary confession had changed the landscape in ways that couldn't be walked back. Gripper could argue the charge level, and he did. At length, making the case that a cut saddle strap was not evidence of murderous intent, that the death had been unintended, that his client had never sought to kill but had made a catastrophic miscalculation, but he couldn't argue the act itself. The words were in the record. Silas had said them in front of a territorial prosecutor, a sheriff, and 2 witnesses. They weren't going anywhere. Harlan Pike testified on the first day. He sat straight in his chair and spoke clearly, which cost him something visible. His hands were flat on his knees with the rigid stillness of someone managing their body by force of will. But his account was precise and consistent, and when Gripper cross-examined him and tried to suggest that 9 months and a move to Harbert's Crossing constituted the behavior of a man whose reliability was in question, Harlan said, "I was afraid." A frightened man isn't a liar. They're 2 different things, and the room was very quiet for a moment after that. Mara testified on the second day. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for most things, by thinking it through until the thinking stopped being useful, and then by going to sleep and letting her mind settle, and then by waking up and simply doing it. She was not a woman who performed emotions for audiences. She answered questions directly and without embellishment, and said "I don't know" clearly when she didn't know. And what she conveyed without trying to convey it was the portrait of a woman who had been living in a condition no one in that room would have chosen for themselves, and had chosen to deal with it by pursuing the truth. Gripper asked her, at one point, whether she had any evidence beyond the horse returning home that had led her to question the original inquest findings. She said, I had 9 months of watching Silas Varden attempt to take my home and my land and my livelihood through legal process while calling it grief management. That wasn't evidence in the formal sense, but it told me something about how a man behaves when he believes he's entitled to something that belongs to someone else. Gripper started to respond, and Hale said something quiet that cut off the response before it began. The hall rustled. Rusk testified about the mineral survey, the proxy company, the timeline, and Silas's statement regarding the burned saddle. He delivered all of it with the dry precision of a man who understood that plain facts stated plainly were more devastating than any theatrical presentation. The land office clerk, whose name was Harriet Harmon, and who had in fact been carrying her own careful knowledge for 9 months, testified voluntarily on the third morning. She had asked to speak to Hale the evening of the second day, and had told him, without prompting, that she had personally filed the proxy survey application, had recognized Silas Varden's name in the ownership documents, and had told no one because she had a family, and the Varden name carried weight in the basin, and she had not known which way any of this was going to fall. She said it in front of the room with a composure that was clearly costing her, and when she finished, she looked at Mara from the witness chair with an expression that carried all of what she hadn't said for 9 months. And Mara gave her a single small nod that was not forgiveness. She wasn't in a position to offer that, but was acknowledgement. You're here now. That counts for something. The verdict came on the afternoon of the third day. Deliberations took 40 minutes, which was not a long time. When the panel returned, Mara was sitting in the front row between Rowan and Rusk, and she had been sitting very still for 40 minutes in the way you sit when you don't trust yourself to move. The chair of the panel was a rancher named Daughtry who'd been in the basin longer than almost anyone and had the permanent squint of a man who'd spent 4 decades looking at things directly. He read the finding without drama. Silas Varden was found culpable for the death of Caleb Ellsworth, not murder in the premeditated sense, as Gripper had managed to successfully argue, but criminal negligence with reckless disregard for life, compounded by deliberate obstruction of justice through destruction of evidence. The sentencing would be handled at the circuit court level and would come in a separate proceeding. But the finding itself, the official, recorded, legal determination that Caleb Ellsworth had not died in an accident, was done. The room made a sound, not organized noise, just the collective release of people who'd been holding something. Mara didn't move for a moment. She was aware of Rowan's hand on the bench beside her, not touching her arm but close. She was aware of Harlan Pike somewhere behind her, exhaling in a way she could hear from 6 feet away. She was aware of the light coming through the hall windows at an angle that made everything look slightly unreal. Then she pressed both hands flat on her knees, the way she'd been pressing her hands flat on things for 9 months, and breathed in once and breathed out. "Okay," she said, quietly to no one in particular. "Okay." Rowan said nothing. He just nodded once, like the word was sufficient. The inheritance ruling came 2 weeks later. It was less dramatic than the criminal hearing a formal document from the territorial court delivered by a clerk who wrote out from Helena specifically for the purpose. It stated that the freeze on the Ellsworth estate was lifted, that Silas Varden's inheritance claim was rendered void by his criminal conviction, and that Mara Ellsworth was recognized as the sole uncontested owner of all property, assets, and land held under the name of Caleb Ellsworth at the time of his death, including the silver deposit beneath Ravenbreak Pass. Mara read the document twice at her kitchen table. Then she set it down and made coffee and drank it and looked at the paper and felt the strangeness of a thing you've been fighting for arriving without ceremony. Nobody knocked on the door. Nobody told her how to feel. The paper just sat on the table and said, "This is yours, and had always been yours, and the period of it not being yours is now formally over." She picked up the document and put it in the drawer under the table where she kept Caleb's mug. Then she went to work. Not laundry, not tack repairs. Something else entirely. The first mining company representative, arrived in Red Willow Basin 12 days after the ruling, which told her he'd been waiting for the outcome. His name was Garfield Strutt, and he worked for a Helena-based operation called Continental Extraction. And he had the practiced manner of a man who expected to meet a widow in difficult circumstances and acquire what he needed at a price that reflected her desperation. He sat down across from her at her kitchen table, and he opened his case and he laid out a proposal with the confidence of a man delivering good news to someone who needed it. The proposal was for the purchase of the mining rights to the Ravenbreak Pass silver deposit. The number he cited was substantial in absolute terms and insulting in relative ones, enough to seem significant to someone who'd been living on laundry wages for 9 months, and far less than what the deposit was worth to a company that had been quietly assessing the territory's mineral potential for 3 years. She read the proposal once. Then she set it down on the table with the flat-handed precision she'd learned from watching Rusk handle documents. "No," she said. Strutt blinked. "Mrs. Ellsworth, I understand this has been a difficult period." "Mr. Strutt," her voice was even, "I'm not selling the land. I'm not selling the mineral rights outright. If Continental Extraction wants to operate on my property, we're going to discuss a different kind of arrangement." He looked at her, the way men look at women who say things they didn't prepare for. What kind of arrangement? She had been thinking about this for 3 weeks. Since the night of Silas's confession, lying in her cold cabin with Caleb's mug on the shelf and the mining company reality pressing in from the edges of what she'd actually won. She wasn't naive enough to think she could extract silver by herself. She wasn't stubborn enough to refuse the practical reality that the deposit required resources she didn't have. But she'd watched what extraction operations did to land and to workers in other valleys, and she'd made decisions about what she was and wasn't willing to have her name attached to. "I want a percentage arrangement," she said, "not a sale. The land stays in my name. Continental extracts and I receive a fixed percentage of the operation's net yield." She paused. "I also want terms, real ones." "Terms?" Strutt said carefully. "Shaft safety standards written into the contract, enforceable by an independent assessment every 6 months. Wage minimums for workers, not whatever the labor market will bear, a fixed floor. Compensation for any worker injured on property under my ownership. Environmental protections for the creek that feeds the ranches downstream, with penalty provisions if those provisions are violated." She looked at him steadily. "And a community fund, a percentage of the operation's annual profit directed to infrastructure in Red Willow Basin roads, medical access, housing for families." Strutt stared at her. She let him stare. "I don't know that Continental is in a position to—" he started. "Then Continental should know that I've written to 2 other extraction companies this week, describing the deposit's scope and inviting proposals," she said. "If Continental's terms can't accommodate what I'm asking, I'm interested to see what the alternatives look like." The silence in the kitchen was very specific. She could hear the stove ticking. Strutt closed his proposal folder, opened it again, then closed it a second time. "I would need to take this back to my principals," he said. "Of course," she said. "I'll be here." He left, and she sat at the table alone for a moment, and then she laughed. Not from triumph, it didn't feel like triumph yet. More from the absurdity of sitting in the same kitchen where a man had dropped a 30-day eviction notice 4 months ago and now negotiating mineral rights with a Helena company representative. She was still sitting there when Rowan knocked on the door. He'd seen the strange horse tied outside and had, she suspected, waited across the road until it left. He came in without being asked. They'd arrived at that level of ease without quite marking when, and looked at the closed proposal folder she'd left on the table. "Continental Extraction," she said before he could ask. I heard they were sniffing around. He sat down across from her. "How did it go?" "He offered me a buyout. I declined and gave him a counterproposal." She looked at the folder. "He's going to go back to his principals, and they're going to tell him she's being unreasonable, and then they're going to try again, with a number that's better but still not right. And we're going to go through this a few more times." "We," he said. She looked up. Figure of speech. But they both knew it wasn't, and neither of them addressed that directly, which was how things had been operating between them for some weeks now. There was a thing building that neither of them had named, and by unspoken agreement, they were being careful with it. Careful the way you're careful with something that matters and is fragile, and could be wrecked by pushing at it wrong. Rowan, she had come to understand, was carrying something specific. He'd been carrying it since the morning after Silas's confession, when he'd become slightly more formal with her in a way she'd initially read as distance and had gradually understood as something else. She'd decided not to let it go on indefinitely. Rowan, she said. Say what you're thinking. He looked at her. His hands were on the table, and he looked at them briefly, then back at her. I'm not thinking anything in particular. You've been thinking the same thing for 3 weeks, and I'm tired of watching you not say it. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, that's direct. I've spent 9 months being indirect, and it nearly cost me everything. I'm done with it as a strategy. She held his gaze. What is it? He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet she'd learned to sit with rather than push into. Then he said, You own a silver mine, Mara. I own land with silver under it. There's a difference, not the kind of difference that changes what I'm talking about. He didn't look away. 3 months ago, you were washing the Dunner family's laundry. You had a frozen account and a 30-day notice on your table, and a fence that needed 3 posts replaced. He stopped. Now you're negotiating with extraction companies, and there are going to be other companies, and there's going to be money, real money, the kind that changes what the word widow means when people say it in your direction. She waited, and I've been at that fence every other day for months, he said. Bringing firewood, bringing supper, riding to Harbert's Crossing. Sitting outside sheriff's offices, he pressed his lips together. People in this valley are going to say what people always say. That I knew, that I saw what was coming and positioned myself accordingly. There it was. She'd understood it was something in this direction for weeks. Hearing it plainly didn't make it smaller. He wasn't wrong that people would say it. People said a great many things in small settlements, and they generally said the most useful version of the story for whatever purpose they happened to need a story for. Is that what you think they'll say? She asked. Or is that what you think? He looked at her for a long moment. I don't think it. But I don't know how to prove I don't think it. You can't prove it, she said. That's not how it works. She kept her eyes on his. You brought firewood when I had nothing and couldn't pay and had no prospect of having anything. You believed me about the horse before there was a single piece of evidence. You rode to Harbert's Crossing because something wrong had happened to someone, and that was reason enough. She paused. I know what that is, and I know why you did it. You can't prove a thing that's already known. He was quiet. I'm not an easy woman, she said, because she felt it needed saying, and she didn't want him to be confused about what he was dealing with. I'm not patient when I'm worried. I have opinions about things that I don't always soften before expressing them. I spent 9 months being a problem that other people had to navigate around, and I don't entirely know how to stop operating that way yet. She folded her hands on the table. And I have a silver deposit and a complicated legal situation and a ranch that needs proper running and a mining negotiation that is going to take most of my attention for the next several months. Rowan said nothing, but he was listening with his whole face. All of that is true, she said, and it's also true that you're the only person in this valley who treated me like a person when it cost something to do it. And I'm not interested in pretending that doesn't matter, because it inconveniently happened before the financial situation changed. The room was quiet. The stove ticked. I'm not asking you for anything right now, she said carefully. I'm just telling you that whatever you decide about this, about any of it, I'd rather you decide it based on what's actually true than based on what some people in a small valley might say about it. Rowan looked at her for a long time. Then he said, You're a formidable woman, Mara Ellsworth. I know, she said. I've had a difficult year to practice. Something broke loose in his expression then, something that had been held carefully in place for a long time released. Not dramatically. He didn't change posture or reach across the table or do any of the things that a different kind of man might do. He just let whatever it was show on his face, unmanaged, and it was enough. "All right," he said. "All right, what? All right, I'm not going anywhere." He said it plainly, without decoration. "And you can let me help with the mining negotiations, because I've dealt with extraction company representatives before, and I know how they frame things to create the impression that the terms are fixed when they aren't." She almost laughed again. "Almost. That's your answer to all of this? Offering to help with contracts?" "I figured I'd start practical," he said. This time she did laugh. It wasn't a polished sound. It was the laugh of a woman who hadn't had much to laugh at for a long time and was slightly out of practice, and it came out a little rough and completely genuine, and Rowan smiled at the sound of it in a way he didn't seem aware he was doing. The second mining company representative arrived the following week. His name was Cowboy. He was from an operation called Summit Mineral out of Billings, and he had done his homework, or someone had done it for him, because he came in knowing about the Continental proposal and knowing it had been declined, and he opened with terms that were materially better. Still not right, but better, which confirmed what Mara had told Rowan. The number Continental had offered was not the number they were prepared to settle at. She and Rowan sat together at the kitchen table across from Calloway, and she noticed that Calloway adjusted his approach almost immediately upon understanding that the woman across the table had someone beside her who was paying attention to the contract language. He'd been ready for a widow. He was less ready for a widow with a rancher who knew what force majeure exclusions meant in the context of environmental liability clauses. They sent Calloway back to Billings with a counteroffer that was specific and had been written out beforehand. "You've done this before," Calloway said as he was leaving, looking at her with something that had shifted from assessment to something closer to respect. "No," she said. "I've watched what happens when people don't, and I decided not to make those mistakes." Calloway almost smiled. "Continental is going to come back." "I know," she said. "Tell your principals to be faster than they are." He left, and Rusk arrived 30 minutes later, which might have been coincidence and probably wasn't. He had the look of a man who'd seen something he wanted to report on. "Gripper was at the telegraph office this morning," he said, accepting the coffee Mara put in front of him. "Sending to Helena 3 messages in 2 hours, which is more than he usually requires." "What does that mean?" Rowan asked. "It means the sentencing discussion is moving," Rusk said. "Gripper's under pressure. The circuit court date is 8 weeks out, and the evidence package Hale submitted is comprehensive." He paused. "I spoke with Hale yesterday. He believes the sentence will be substantial. Not what it would have been if this were premeditated murder, because the finding didn't go that far. But he said, given the destruction of evidence, the sustained cover-up, the 9 months of legal maneuvering against the victim's widow, while concealing responsibility, the court is going to want to make a statement." Mara looked at her coffee. "Does that matter to you?" Rusk asked. "Length." She thought about it honestly. "Not as much as I thought it would," she said. "What matters is that it's real, that it's on record. That somewhere in this territory there is an official document saying Caleb Ellsworth did not die in an accident, and the man responsible was held accountable for it." She paused. "The length of the sentence is between Silas and the court." "I'm not carrying that." Rusk nodded slowly, like a man who'd expected a different answer and found this one more sensible. "One more thing," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "The piece of Caleb's saddle cinch that Silas burned, obviously we don't have that. But in his confession he described the cut, the angle, the depth, the placement. He set the paper on the table. I had a saddle maker come in from Helena and make an assessment based on the description. He wrote up a technical document explaining what a cut at that angle and depth would do to a riding rig under trail conditions." He looked at her. "Hale's using it in the sentencing proceeding, but I thought you should have a copy." She unfolded the paper and read it. It was clinical, precise, written in the language of someone who understood leather mechanics and load tolerances and the physics of a saddle failing under a specific kind of pressure on a specific kind of terrain. It was the closest thing to proof she would ever have of what had happened to her husband. She folded it back carefully and set it beside the territorial court ruling document that was still sitting on the table. 2 pieces of paper, one that said the property was hers, one that explained how she'd become a widow. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. Rusk finished his coffee and stood. At the door he paused in the way he sometimes did, not quite hesitation, more like a man adding a final item to a completed list. "You handled yourself well through all of this, Mrs. Ellsworth," he said. "I don't say that because it's a pleasant thing to say. I say it because it's accurate, and I thought you should hear it from someone who watched it." He left before she could respond, which she suspected was intentional. Rowan looked at her across the table. "He's right," Rowan said. "Don't start," she said. "I'm not starting anything. It's just true." She looked at the 2 pieces of paper on the table, at the coffee mug in her hand that was Caleb's and was now also just a coffee mug she used, at the window through which the fence was visible, and beyond it the road, and beyond that the valley that had spent 9 months watching her manage and was now going to have to figure out a new way to understand who she was. She was going to have to figure that out herself, too. The woman who'd pressed her hands flat on surfaces to keep them from shaking was still her. She wasn't gone, but she was also something that hadn't existed before the last 9 months, harder in places, more certain of what she could carry, less interested in making herself smaller to fit other people's expectations of widows and women and what either of those things was allowed to want. She was also, for the first time since October of the previous year, looking forward rather than back. Not without effort, not perfectly, but forward, which was the direction she needed. The Continental Extraction representative came back, as Calloway had predicted he would. It took them 11 days, which was faster than Mara expected, and told her something about the size of what was underneath Ravenbreak Pass. Companies that were in no hurry didn't move in 11 days. Companies that were watching a competitor circle the same territory and calculating the cost of losing it, those companies moved in 11 days. Strutt returned with a different folder and a different number and a manner that had been recalibrated in the interim. He was still polished, still practiced, but the particular quality of confidence he'd brought to the first meeting was gone. In its place was something that looked like professional respect, which Mara understood was also strategic. He'd gone back to his principles. They'd assessed the situation, and they'd concluded that the approach needed adjusting. She sat across from him with Rowan beside her and a copy of Summit Minerals' counteroffer on the table between them, face down. Strutt presented the new terms. The percentage was higher. The safety language was present, though vague in the places that mattered most. Community fund was absent. She turned over Summit's counteroffer and slid it across the table. Strutt read it. His expression did the thing that expressions do when a person encounters a number. They didn't expect a brief, involuntary tightening around the eyes before the professional surface reasserted itself. "Summit is serious," he said. "Summit is in the conversation," Mara said. "Whether they're serious depends on how the next 2 weeks go." She looked at him steadily. "What I want from Continental is the same thing I said the first time. The percentage arrangement, the safety standards with independent enforcement, the wage floor, the injury compensation, the creek protections with penalties, and the community fund. All of it, not some of it. The community fund is unusual," Strutt said. "So is a widow who survived 9 months of legal assault and still owns the land you're sitting here trying to extract." She said it without heat, just as a counter to his factual observation. "I'm aware that what I'm asking is not standard. I'm asking for it anyway." Strutt looked at her for a moment, then at Rowan, who had said almost nothing the entire meeting, and whose silence had a quality to it, attentive, present. The silence of someone who was tracking every word and would have something precise to say if called upon. That Strutt had clearly noticed and was accounting for. "I'll need 2 more weeks," Strutt said. "You have 10 days, Mara said." "Summit is waiting." Strutt left and Rowan leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. You're going to give them the 2 weeks, he said. Of course I am, but he doesn't need to know that yet. She picked up Summit's counteroffer and looked at it. Summit's safety language is better than Continental's. Their percentage is lower. I need Continental to come up to the safety standard before I'll consider the percentage question. You've been thinking about this more than you've been sleeping, Rowan said. She set the paper down, probably. Mara, I'm fine. I didn't say you weren't fine. I said, you've been thinking about this more than you've been sleeping. She looked at him. He was right, and she knew he was right, and she was tired enough that arguing about it felt like a waste of energy she didn't have to spare. Okay, she said. Yes, I have been. Why? She considered the question seriously. It would have been easy to say something about the negotiations or the deadline or the pressure of 2 companies in play. All of that was true, and none of it was the real answer. Because if I stop moving, I might notice how strange this all is, she said finally. Sitting in this kitchen negotiating with Helena companies about silver deposits. 4 months ago, I was calculating whether I could afford lamp oil. She pressed the heel of her hand against the edge of the table. It doesn't feel like the same life, and I don't entirely know what to do with that. Rowan was quiet for a moment. It is the same life, he said. You're the same person who was buying lamp oil. You just have more room now. She looked at him. That's not a small thing, he said. But it's not a different person. It's the same person in different circumstances. She thought about that. It wasn't a complicated thing he'd said, but it was the right thing, which wasn't always the same as complicated. I know, she said. I just needed to hear it out loud. He nodded. Then, with the kind of directness that she'd come to understand, was simply how he operated when he wasn't managing himself out of something. Have supper with me tonight. Not here, at the Basin dining room, like regular people who aren't conducting business. She almost said no, from habit more than intention. She'd been saying no to things for 9 months on the basis that she didn't have the energy or the standing or the right to take up space in ways that weren't productive. She caught herself doing it. All right, she said. He smiled. Not the small, contained expression she'd first catalogued at the fence in the early months. Something fuller than that changed the whole geography of his face. She looked away before she made too much of it. Supper at the Basin dining room was the most ordinary thing she'd done in months, which made it extraordinary. They sat at a corner table and ate food that someone else had cooked and talked about his cattle operation, which had been running thin on his attention through the investigation and the hearings, and needed work before the serious cold set in, and about the North Road situation, which had been a topic of Basin conversation for 2 years without resolution, and about whether Harlan Pike had settled anywhere useful or was still drifting. Harlan, it turned out, had not gone back to Harbert's Crossing. Rusk had quietly put in a word with a rancher up the valley named Breslow, who ran a legitimate operation and needed reliable help, and Harlan had taken the position. He'd sent Mara a note, 3 lines, that said he was glad he'd come back and sorry it had taken him so long, and that he hoped things went right for her from here. She'd kept the note without quite deciding to. Do you think he'll be all right? She asked Rowan. I think he did something hard and it cost him, and he did it anyway, Rowan said. That's a decent foundation for being all right. She thought about that while the dining room moved around them, the ordinary noise of a settlement's people eating and talking and existing in the present tense, and felt something she'd been slowly assembling over the past weeks crystallize into a more complete shape. She had been so focused on what needed doing: the investigation, the hearings, the negotiations, the legal process grinding forward, that she hadn't let herself sit with what was also true at the same time. That she was still here, that she'd built something out of 9 months that had been designed to break her. That the man sitting across the table from her had shown up at her fence in the beginning for no reason that served him, and had stayed for every reason that mattered. And that she was aware of this in a way that had been building quietly for a long time, and was now present enough that she couldn't keep pretending it was a background detail. She didn't say any of this over supper. Some things needed their proper moment, and a corner table in the Basin dining room wasn't quite it. But she thought it, and she let herself think it, which was its own kind of progress. The sentencing hearing happened in Helena, which meant Mara made the long journey by coach on a cold morning in late November with Rusk and Hale, leaving Rowan to manage her stock for the 2 days she'd be gone. She hadn't asked him to do it. He'd offered before she had the chance to figure out the logistics, which told her he'd thought about it before she had, which told her something about where his mind was operating these days. She sat in the Helena courthouse, larger than anything in Red Willow Basin, formal in the way of buildings that were meant to convey authority, and watched Silas Varden stand before the circuit court judge. He looked smaller than she'd expected. Or perhaps she'd expected him to look the way he'd looked at his best, the coat and the controlled expression, and the manner of a man who understood power and how to carry it. What she saw instead was a man in his mid-50s who had been inside for weeks, whose controlled expression had been worn down to something closer to its actual face underneath, and who stood in front of the judge with his hands clasped in front of him and his eyes straight ahead, and something in him that was not remorse exactly, but was the appearance of a person who had finally run out of the particular energy that it takes to maintain a long lie. Gripper argued mitigation. He was skilled at it, the unintended outcome, the catastrophic miscalculation, the absence of direct murderous intent, the long service Silas had rendered to the territorial community, the impact of a severe sentence on a man of his age. He made the case as well as it could be made. Hale made the counter case. He was precise and unhurried, and he let the facts do the work that lesser prosecutors tried to do with rhetoric. Timeline, the survey, the saddle, the burned evidence. The 9 months of legal maneuvering against a widow while concealing responsibility. The community that had been manipulated into dismissing her legitimate questions. The young hand who'd had to flee to a horse camp in the middle of nowhere because a powerful man had made it clear that knowing the truth was dangerous. The judge was a woman, which Mara had not expected. Her name was Clara Prentice, and she had been on the circuit bench for 7 years and had the manner of someone who had heard every available version of human failure and had stopped being surprised by any of it without becoming indifferent to any of it. Judge Prentice sentenced Silas Varden to 14 years in the territorial penitentiary. She read the sentence in the same measured voice she'd used for the entire proceeding, and then she said something that wasn't required something, she added herself, above the formal requirements of the proceeding. She said, "The court notes that the injury in this case extended beyond the loss of a life. The systematic legal campaign conducted against Mrs. Ellsworth during the period of the defendant's concealment represents an abuse of the territory's legal mechanisms for personal gain at the expense of a person the defendant had already injured catastrophically. This court wishes the record to reflect that Mrs. Ellsworth's persistent pursuit of truth under those conditions was not the behavior of a grieving woman unable to accept loss, as it was characterized by some at the time. It was the behavior of someone who was right." The courtroom was quiet. Mara pressed her hands flat on her knees. She was not going to cry in this room. She was not going to do anything visible. She sat very still and let the judge's words settle into her, and she thought Caleb. She thought his name, and let it be just his name, without the question mark, without the 9 months of tangled uncertainty, without the grief that had been contaminated by the things she'd known and couldn't prove. Just Caleb. A man she'd loved, a man who'd tried to protect something and hadn't had enough time. A man who'd been failed by the territory he'd lived in and served by the woman he'd married, even if the serving had come 9 months too late to save him. She thought, "I'm sorry it took so long. And then, I think you would have figured out how to say thank you in a way that didn't sound like a greeting card, and that made something in her chest hurt and ease at the same time." Rusk rode back to Red Willow Basin in the coach with her. He didn't say much, which was how Rusk was. But somewhere around the midpoint of the journey, with the Helena lights behind them, and the basin still hours ahead, he said, "You've got some work ahead of you with the mining contracts. I know people in the valley are watching how you handle it." He paused. not because they're waiting for you to fail. Some of them because they're hoping you'll do it differently than it's usually done. She looked at him. Is that the sheriff's observation or a personal one? Both, he said, which was the most he'd ever said about himself in her presence. She thought about that for the rest of the journey. Continental came back in 9 days 1 day early, which was its own kind of message. The new terms were close, not perfect. The safety inspection language was better. The wage floor was right. The creek protections had teeth. The community fund was present, smaller than she'd asked for, with a ceiling that she didn't agree with. She asked for the ceiling to be removed and replaced with a fixed annual minimum with no upper cap. Strutt went very still when she said that. That's an open-ended commitment, he said. That's a commitment to the community that sustains the operation, she said. The men working the shafts are going to come from this valley. Their families live here. The roads their supply wagons use run through this settlement. I'm not interested in an operation that extracts what it needs from a community and caps what it gives back. Rowan was beside her and said nothing, but she heard him shift slightly in his chair and understood it as agreement. Strutt said he needed to make a call to Helena. He used the telegraph office for 40 minutes. Then he came back and said Continental would accept the uncapped minimum with a renegotiation clause at the 5-year mark. She asked Rowan to review the renegotiation clause language before she accepted. Rowan read it, made 2 suggestions, and Strutt incorporated both. She signed the agreement on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks before the first snow of winter came to Red Willow Basin. She signed it at her kitchen table in the same cabin where she'd been handed a 30-day eviction notice and hadn't cried and had pressed her hands flat and stayed standing. She signed it and then sat with the pen still in her hand for a moment. You did it, Rowan said from across the table. We did it, she said. Don't be modest about it. You caught the indemnity language in the original draft that would have let them void the safety provisions. You would have caught it, maybe. Later, she set the pen down. Earlier is better. He smiled. She looked at him across the table in her kitchen, in the cabin she owned outright in the valley, where she had once hauled wash baskets and been watched from porches, and she made a decision. Not about the mine or the contract or the legal situation. About the other thing that had been sitting between them since the evening at the dining room, sitting between them well before. That, if she was being honest, sitting there since a fence post in early autumn, when a rancher brought firewood he said he had too much of and she made coffee because it was cold. Walk with me, she said. He looked up now, yes. He followed her outside without asking where. She walked to the fence, the same weather fence that needed 3 posts replaced, that she'd been standing at and leaning against and pressing her palms to for months, the fence that was the consistent geography of every conversation that had mattered. She stopped beside the post he'd first leaned against and put her hand on it the way she always did. The afternoon was cold and clear. The valley spread below them toward the south, and Ravenbreak Pass was visible on the northern ridge, the high line of it, wild and unforgiving, the way it had always been. Unchanged by everything that had happened beneath it and around it and because of it. I want to say something, Mara said, and I want you to let me finish before you respond. Rowan leaned against the fence post. All right. You told me a few weeks ago that you were afraid people would think you'd spent these months positioning yourself. That the kindness looked like investment in retrospect. She looked at the fence rail under her hand. I told you I knew what it was and why you did it. That's still true. She paused. But I didn't tell you what it meant to me. And I think you should know. He was very still. I was already losing, she said. Before you showed up. Not the legal case I might have gotten there eventually. I like to think I would have. But something else. I was losing the thing that lets you believe that other people are worth trusting. That asking for help isn't weakness and accepting it isn't debt. That not everyone who stands near you is calculating what they can get. She looked at him. I was about to become someone very hard and very alone, and I was going to call it survival and mean it, and I would have been wrong. The wind moved through the fence posts between them. You changed that, she said. Not because you rescued me, you didn't. I did most of my own rescuing, and I think you understood that from the start. But because you showed up anyway, without needing to, without being asked, without it making any practical sense for a man with his own struggling ranch and his own problems and no particular reason to stand at a widow's fence in the cold. She paused. That changed what I thought was possible, and I needed that changed badly, and I didn't even know how badly until it happened. Rowan said nothing. His jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with displeasure. I'm not a romantic woman, in the way some people mean that, she said. I don't expect things to be easy or to work out because they should. I'm also not 23, and I've been a wife and a widow, and I know what both of those feel like and what they ask of you. She kept her eyes on his. But I also know what it feels like to be known by someone. And you know me, the actual version of me, not the widow in difficulty, not the woman who got lucky with silver, not the version people in the valley are still deciding how to categorize. You knew me at the fence with a basket of someone else's laundry, and you know me at the table negotiating mining contracts, and you know the parts in between. She stopped, made sure the next part came out the way she meant it. That is not nothing, she said. That is, in fact, the thing that matters more than anything else I can think of. And I thought you should hear it said plainly, because I am done with things I should have said going unsaid. The silence that followed was the same quality of silence that had been there on the best of their conversations full, not empty. Then Rowan pushed off the fence post and took 2 steps toward her, and he took her hand not dramatically, just took it. The way you take hold of something you've been careful with for a long time and have decided to stop being careful about, and he said, I've been in love with you since Harbert's Crossing. She looked at him. Since Harbert's Crossing. When you walked up to that scared kid and told him that being afraid didn't make him a liar. When you didn't threaten him or perform sympathy at him, you just told him the truth plainly and let him decide. His thumb moved across her knuckles. I thought, that is a person worth riding toward any number of difficult things for. She said that was functional rather than romantic. I'm a practical man, he said. Romance looks different on me. Something in her chest that had been careful and contained for a very long time simply let go. Rowan, she said, are you going to propose or are you going to continue being practical at me? He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed a real laugh, warm and slightly undone, the first time she'd ever heard him laugh like that, and then he said, Mara Ellsworth, will you marry me? It wasn't even entirely a question, which she found both presumptuous and accurate. Yes, she said, obviously yes. He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly against his jaw in the way of a man who didn't know what else to do with the fullness of the moment, and she felt the roughness of cold skin and the warmth underneath it and thought, this is real and this is mine, and I didn't imagine it into existence. It built itself in the cold and the difficulty and the long months of ordinary hard work, and that is why it will hold. They stood at the fence in the gathering cold for a while longer, not solving anything, not discussing the next practical step. Just standing. Just being the 2 people they were imperfect, practical, tired in the bones from a long year, and in possession of something they'd both, against various odds, arrived at, still intact enough to offer. The snow came 3 weeks later. The first heavy snowfall of that winter arrived on a Saturday morning before the valley was fully awake, the kind that falls in the dark and covers everything by the time anyone opens a door to look. Mara stood on her front step and watched it coming down in the thin early light and felt the season turn. They married that same day. It wasn't planned that way. The territorial justice who'd agreed to perform the ceremony had come in from the north end of the valley the previous afternoon, expecting clear roads, and had gotten snowed in at the Basin boarding house. Rowan had appeared at Mara's door at 8 in the morning in the snow with his hat on, and a look on his face that was both completely serious and slightly ridiculous, and said, Pearson's stuck here. If you're still of the same mind, we could do it today instead of waiting for the spring date. She'd looked at him, standing in the snow on her step. I'm still of the same mind, she said. They married in the Basin Community Hall with Rusk and the Colfax family and Harriet Harmon from the land office and a handful of other people who happened to be inside the building when the word spread. Harlan Pike, who had come down from Breslow's ranch for supplies and been similarly caught by the snow, stood in the back in his work coat looking like a man who hadn't expected the day to become significant and was finding that it had become significant anyway. There was no ceremony in the elaborate sense. Pearson said what was required, and they said what was required, and that was done. And then there was food because someone had produced it, and there was noise because there were people. And at some point, Rusk shook Rowan's hand with the particular serious warmth of a man who didn't waste gestures, and then he found Mara and said, "I hope it's a good one." "I think it will be," she said. "I wasn't talking about the marriage," he said. Though that too, I meant all of it. The whole next part. She looked at him. He was already moving away, already done with the sentiment because he'd said it, and that was sufficient. She smiled at his back and thought that he was, without question, the most efficient human being she had ever met, and also one of the most decent. The mining operation at Ravenbreak Pass began construction the following spring. Continental ran the shafts. Mara approved every phase of the construction plan against the contract terms, and when they tried to downgrade the ventilation system in the second shaft to save money, she caught it in the progress report and wrote a letter that was direct enough that the project manager called it the most politely devastating piece of correspondence he'd received in 20 years of extraction work. The ventilation system was installed to spec. The first wages were paid at the level she'd negotiated, which was higher than any mining operation in the territory was paying at the time, and the word spread among workers in adjacent valleys, the way good wages always spread quickly and accurately. The shafts were staffed within 6 weeks. Most of the workers came from Red Willow Basin and the surrounding settlements, which meant the money they earned was spent locally, which meant the basin's general store ordered more stock, which meant the road to the supply depot needed improving, which meant the community fund's first major project almost selected itself. Rowan managed both operations, his cattle ranch and the Ellsworth Ranch, now combined under shared management with separate ownership with the same steady competence he brought to everything, complaining when it was worth complaining about and getting on with it when it wasn't. He was not a perfect man. He was occasionally short when he was overwhelmed and didn't always say when he needed help and had a stubbornness about certain ranch decisions that required actual argument to move. She argued. He reconsidered when she was right and held firm when he was right, and they were both right often enough that it worked. She was not a perfect woman either. She knew this without being told. She ran ahead of conversation sometimes, having made decisions internally before including him, which he found frustrating. She had mornings when the weight of the previous year came back in the unguarded hours before full wakefulness, when she lay in the dark and felt the old grief and the old anger and had to simply let it move through rather than grabbing for it. She had moments of dealing with the mining company representatives that were probably harder than necessary because some part of her was still processing what it meant to be taken seriously, and she was still calibrating the difference between appropriate firmness and operating from old wounds. She worked on it. That was all she could do. The community fund built the North Road improvements in the first year. In the second year, it funded the basin's first resident doctor, a young woman from Portland named Ida Webb, who had graduated from a medical program that had admitted her largely by accident and trained her completely on purpose, and who turned out to be exactly as capable as her training suggested and considerably tougher than the basin expected. Ida Webb became one of Mara's closest friends in the way that two capable women in a small settlement sometimes become friends not through grand gestures, but through consistent mutual respect and the specific comfort of being around. Someone who doesn't need you to be less than you are. The third year, the fund built workers' housing on the north side of the valley. 8 small houses properly insulated with gardens. Families moved in before the snow. Mara visited each house during the first week and didn't make a speech because she wasn't that kind of person, but she helped carry furniture and she knew everyone's names, and she went home that evening and sat at her kitchen table and felt, in a way that was different from the satisfaction of winning an argument or closing a contract, something that was closer to rightness, like a thing that should exist, existing. Caleb's mug was still on the shelf. She still used it occasionally. Rowan had seen it there from the first morning he'd stayed, and had never asked about it and had never moved it, both of which she appreciated in ways she'd never put into exact language. She'd told him about it once, the morning after a night, when the old grief had come back harder than usual and she'd been quieter than she meant to be. She told him what the mug was and why it was there, and he'd listened and then said, "It should stay there," and that was the end of that conversation. Which was the right conversation to have had. The piece of Caleb's saddle leather, not the actual piece, which had been burned, but the saddle maker's technical document that Rusk had given her in those weeks before the sentencing she put in the drawer of her desk in the small room off the main cabin that had become her office. She took it out occasionally, not to revisit the grief, which didn't need documents to revisit itself when it wanted to, but to remember the sequence of it, what it had taken to get from the cold morning with the eviction notice to where she was. The sequence mattered. She thought it mattered to remember it not as a story about how things worked out because she deserved it to, but as an account of what was actually required, the relentlessness, the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions in front of people who'd rather she didn't, the specific kind of courage that isn't dramatic, but is just doing the next necessary thing past the point where you'd like to stop. She had a daughter in the 4th year. They named her Clara, which was Mara's mother's name, and which also, though she never said this to anyone except Rowan, had the quality of honoring Judge Clara Prentice in the Helena courthouse, who had said into the official record she was right. She had a son the year after that, and that one they named Caleb James, the James being for Rowan's father, and the Caleb being exactly what it was. Rowan had offered the name unprompted, which told her everything about who he was. Silas served 11 years of his 14-year sentence before his health failed significantly enough that the question of release came before the territorial board. Mara was asked whether she wished to submit a statement for the consideration. She sat with the question for 3 days. Then she wrote a statement that was a page and a half, in which she said that the sentence had been appropriate to the crime, that the crime had taken from her something that could not be restored by any length of imprisonment, and that she had no interest in the extension of his suffering beyond what the court had ordered. She said that she had built a life on the other side of what he'd done, and that it was a good life, and that she was going to continue building it regardless of what the board decided. She said she had no recommendation about his release. She signed it and sent it and didn't think much more about it. He was released on medical grounds 2 months later. She heard from Rusk, who'd moved into a quieter role as the basin's population grew. She received the information, put it in the same mental drawer as other things that were finished, and went back to the mining company progress report she'd been reading when Rusk's message arrived. The fence got new posts in the spring of the 3rd year. Rowan replaced them on a Saturday morning with the same unceremonious competence he brought to physical work, and she watched him from the step with her coffee and thought about the fence as it had been when they'd first stood on either side of it, her on the inside, him on his horse on the outside. The world configured in a particular way that neither of them could have predicted would rearrange itself into what it eventually became. She thought about the things that had been built at that fence line. Not the formal things, the investigation, the case, the contracts, the negotiation. But the other things, the particular trust that comes from someone seeing you at your most pressured and most reduced and continuing to show up anyway. The thing that had grown between them in cold mornings and long silences and honest conversations that neither of them had planned to have. She thought, this is not the life I had before, and it is not the life I expected to have. and I could not have designed it from the outside because I didn't know enough about what I was actually capable of or what I actually needed. It required all of it, the loss and the fight and the difficult months and the people who showed up when they didn't have to arrive here. That wasn't a comfortable thought. It wasn't the kind of thing you could say to someone who was in the middle of their own version of the worst year, without sounding like you were making it easier than it was. You couldn't tell a person standing at the edge of their own Ravenbreak Pass that it was going to matter later. That wasn't useful to them, and it wasn't honest, because mattering later didn't make the present bearable, and the present was where they were living. True, and what she held on to was something simpler, that she had not looked away. That when the comfortable version of the truth accident, grief, move on, let it be had been offered to her repeatedly by people who meant well and people who didn't, she had kept asking the question that didn't have a comfortable answer yet. That was the thing she'd done, not perfectly, not heroically, not without fear or exhaustion, or the very human desire to just stop and let someone else carry it. But she had kept asking, and the asking had changed everything. Not just for her, for Harlan Pike, who'd been hiding in Harbert's Crossing with a secret that was eating him from the inside. For Harriet Harmon, who'd been quietly carrying what she knew and waiting for the ground to be safe enough to stand on. For the basin workers in the new houses who were earning wages that assumed their lives mattered. For the families whose creek was still clean because someone had put it in writing and meant it. Uncomfortable truths, pursued by one person who refuses to put them down, have a way of traveling further than anyone expects. She rode up to Ravenbreak Pass on a day in early autumn, 5 years after Caleb died on that trail. She rode with Rowan on one side and Clara on a small, gentle horse between them, the boy being not quite old enough for the elevation yet, and left with Ida Webb for the afternoon. The aspens were turning along the lower trail, and the air had that particular quality of high autumn in the mountains, cool and clean and slightly thin, like the world was being held up to the light. She rode up past the lower switchbacks, and up through the middle section and up to the bend at the top. The specific narrow bend where the trail curved and the ground dropped on the east side, and an experienced rider on a good horse had fallen 9 months into her marriage and not come home. Stopped there. Clara looked around with the clear, uncomplicated curiosity of a 4-year-old encountering altitude for the first time. Rowan sat quietly on her left. Mara looked at the trail, the edge, the ravine below, the way the mountains continued beyond it in every direction, indifferent and permanent and entirely unconcerned with the small, significant dramas that played out along their flanks. She didn't feel the heaviness she'd expected to feel. Or rather, she felt it, but underneath it was something that hadn't been there before. Not peace exactly, peace was too easy a word for it. More like the feeling of a question that had been answered as fully as it was going to be answered, and that you had made the decision to live with the answer and build on it rather than continuing to argue with it. She thought, Caleb. She thought his name the way she'd learned to think it directly, without the question that had been attached to it for 9 months, without the grief contaminated by uncertainty. Just his name, just the person he was. She thought, I did what I could. I did it later than you needed, and I'm sorry for that. But I did it. Clara pointed at something below a hawk, riding a thermal in the space below the pass, and said, Mama, look! With the particular urgency of a small child who has seen something beautiful and needs to know that you have also seen it. I see it, Mara said. Beautiful, isn't it? Yes, Clara said with complete conviction. Rowan looked at Mara across the top of their daughter's head. And what passed between them in that look wasn't a word or a gesture, but something that had been built slowly and honestly and at considerable cost, and was therefore more solid than most things. And she received it and held it, and it was enough. She turned her horse back toward the trail down. Below them, Red Willow Basin spread in the valley, the settlement, the ranches, the new houses to the north, the road that had been improved in the first year of the fund, the ribbon of creek that still ran clean along the eastern valley edge. Smoke from chimneys, the ordinary, persistent, particular life of a place. She had fought for the truth on this mountain. She had earned the freedom to ride down from it. She rode down with both hands on the reins and her daughter beside her, and the full weight of a life that had been tested past any reasonable expectation and had held not because it was built for that, but because the person at the center of it had refused, even when refusing was unreasonable and costly and exhausting and lonely, to let the truth be buried with the man who died, trying to protect it. The aspens moved in the wind below. The pass stayed wild behind her. She didn't look back.